And I think that's something that's really important as a superintendent, is that you're willing to model taking risks. Not that you take them, but you actually, other people see that you're doing stuff, you're willing to try new things. And one of the things that you were bragging about before we even got in here is actually how well PLCs have been going in your district. But it wasn't just because you saw, PLC somewhere and you said we should do it here. It was a really thoughtful implementation process. And I think if you can talk a little bit about that process and how you've got to the point, because it wasn't just you showed up PLCs, there was something really thoughtful in that. And I think this is so important because a lot of times we see great ideas in other districts and then we just say we should do it, and then they fail. But really you've seen success. What did you do to make sure that you're setting up, your community for success in that area specifically?
Yeah, so one of the first things we heard here when we mentioned PLCs was, we've already tried that and it didn't work, or it doesn't work. We did that and we moved on to something else. And I think through my career, one of the things that I have seen really derail something is when one cabinet member or one executive leader has an idea and they want to implement a program, and they kind of do it on their own. And so if you think about like a teaching and learning or curriculum and instruction, that's usually coming out of that shop. And so that leader says, well, this is what teachers are going to do in our district, and they try to roll it out. But then you have your director of technology that doesn't know anything about it, or your director of special education that doesn't know anything about it. And so they're unable to support that work. And so one thing I've always felt very strongly about is, if we're going to do something, we're all doing it. And so we spent the first whole year just training our administrative team. And I don't care what your role was. You were the head of maintenance and operations, you were the head of transportation, you learned what PLCs are, you learned all the foundational information. You could see it. If you walked into a classroom, you would know whether it was happening or not. Then we rolled it out to staff. And I think that was very important because we were all supporting it. It didn't matter who your supervisor was or who was running your area of the district. They knew it, they expected it to be done, they understood and appreciated the work, and they knew that as a district, this is what we expected to happen. That doesn't mean it's perfect. That doesn't mean there aren't some people who maybe don't agree with it. But as a system, we've laid this very clear expectation that this is our way of work in Riverview.
Yeah, and then you're setting it up so you're like basically the don't die scuba right? So and I think that's something, if we ever want something to, if people are supporting the classrooms, you have to start with the administrators, that they understand it. They can actually back it up too, because it can't be just say, hey, you got to do this, but I don't really understand what you're doing, but you also have to do it. So I really appreciate that, that emphasis. And, there is, as a superintendent, I'm sure what I've seen a lot of times with school districts is, especially if you do not get the principals on board with it, that's where it tends to fail. Because, as long as they have good communication skills, they can kind of get away with stuff a little bit. So you have to get them on board too. So I really appreciate that intentional practice of like, how do we as administrators really learn this and understand it from the viewpoint of a learner?